What's up, guys? We are back for some 7-point Old School Singleton action, and I have the pleasure today of being joined by a very good friend of mine and co-commander collaborator, Nate Prawdzik. Want to say hi there, Nate?
Hey there.
Nate and I have been actually friends since, I believe, 1999, when I met him when I moved to UC Davis, or to the Davis area in California, and we've steadily kept in touch since then. We've played a bunch of formats over the years, and over the last maybe 7 or 8 years, we've been putting our heads together as co-collaborators on a whole series of commander decks. And though Nate has actually not played in any Old School Singleton events yet, he's definitely been thinking about the format, and will hopefully be able to play some events down the road. At least for the time being, he's more than happy to bounce ideas off of me. And I thought he would make a great commentary companion to cover the event which you are about to see unfold in front of you across a series of games. This is the event number 10 finals that were contested not quite a month ago. On the left side, we've got Dave Firth Bard, who is a very experienced player of the format. And on the right, we have Simon Christie. This is a very interesting battle of archetypes. And I guess without further ado, probably the best thing to do would be to just hop into the deck list so that Nate and I can break them down for you guys. I'm going to bring up Dave's deck first, which is right in front of you here. And Nate, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what Dave is playing here.
Yeah, this is the mono white deck, and I just a couple things that stood out to me that I thought were interesting is that he doesn't really have any way to pick up additional cards, probably because they raised the price of land tax, as I recall.
Actually, land tax has been sitting at a 2-point budget. I believe it was originally budgeted at 1, and it was showing up in tons of deck lists. So in fact, yeah, it was moved to 2 a little while ago, and it's actually a very interesting decision for him not to run that card. But yeah, continue.
Yeah, and then of course, the synergies with Armageddon. But the other thing that's interesting, so he has to make up his card advantage if he's going to get it with cards like Armageddon, specifically Balance.
Yeah, it seems like
others, right?
Yeah, it seems like it's very interesting actually that he opted to run with a Mox Pearl over land tax. If you think back to the other white deck that we saw, basically another white Weenie strategy with a little bit of red that was in event number 9, and that was the deck played by Mikkel Fee. He was running red white, and he instead opted to play with land tax over Mox Pearl, which not only introduced potentially a more powerful card to his deck, but also saved him 1 point that he could budget to something else. What do you think about the decision to use Mox Pearl over land tax?
Yeah, well, the other thing is that if he's valuing artifact mana that highly, there's no Fellwar Stone in this deck. Yeah. So, yeah, it's a little bit of an odd choice to me, and I think your point about being 3 points versus 2, I'd rather, personally, I think I'd rather run a Fellwar Stone and put 2 points into land tax, and then you've got the same amount of artifact mana plus an open point.
Yeah, and an open point would probably yield, you could probably run a card like, well, Winter Orb would probably work really, really well in the deck. That's quite a good choice, I think, at 1. Probably the most likely thing you'd want to run in a white Weenie strategy if you, in fact, had a point to spare. And given the fact that he's also gone, I mean, we'll get to this when we break down the deck a little further, but he's gone pretty heavily on artifact kill in general, running not just Disenchant and Divine Offering, which are pretty much ubiquitous choices across the format if you are running white, and are 2 of the primary reasons to run the color white in the first place, regardless of whether or not you're running a creature strategy. But he's actually decided to use Dust to Dust as well, which is a card that hasn't shown up in a lot of deck lists in the format, even decks playing white. And yeah, what do you think about that choice to run the Dust to Dust?
I get why he's doing it, because obviously artifacts work their way around Balance and Armageddon typically, traditionally. But on the other hand, I thought it was a little bit, I don't know, it seems a little ambitious, because artifacts most of them are priced out of the market, but also,
you're talking about mana artifacts, right?
In terms of mana artifacts,
yeah.
Right. And then Armageddon essentially disenchants Jam-Day Tome anyway.
Yeah, that's a very valid point.
Yeah, so the main ones that you would be concerned about, I don't know, it just seemed a little bit conspicuous to me, and I don't see, unless I'm missing something, I don't see an Argivian Archaeologist, which I would favor in that slot, given that he's got Chaos Orb and Aeolipile.
Yeah.
So,
and other artifacts that might in fact be integral to his strategy that could get destroyed, like the Chaos Orb or even potentially the Mox Pearl. I'm going to
right.
Yeah, I'm just going to run over some of the other choices here. There's actually a huge overlap between Dave's deck and the deck that Mikkel played in Event 9. If we go across the top here, it's sort of kind of the best of White Weenie. So we've got, as far as overlap cards, Thunder Spirit, Aelipal, Javelineer, Banalish Hero. Over on the upper right-hand corner, there's Clergy of the Holy Nimbus, which is actually a 1-drop that Mikkel opted not to use. And it's actually a pretty pesky card to deal with. The fact that it has built-in regeneration unless the opponent pays 1 additional mana can mean that it's a little bit problematic to deal with in those early stages of the game when you're kind of just trying to play on curve and trying to develop, and you may not find yourself with an extra mana to spare, and that could allow Clergy of the Holy Nimbus to get through for extra damage or even to block. And moving down, Order of Leapor, obviously probably the best overall white creature in the format, with maybe the exception of Preacher, given the fact that it's pumpable, first striking, pro-black, just kind of does everything you want. There's Mace of Pegasus, obviously, an incredibly powerful bander. Savannah Lions, which I think is probably, it's without a doubt the best white creature in regular Old School, but I actually think that in this Singleton format where the individual value of every card is higher, needs to be higher, I actually think that Order of Leapor is a considerably better card overall than Savannah Lions because it's just more flexible and allows you to pierce through defenses a little bit better, particularly in the late game. It's got Banalish Infantry, which is just kind of like a strict upgrade on Banalish Hero. Pikemen, these are all cards from Mikkel's deck. Divine Offering, and then Balance, which is a card that I don't recall if Mikkel was playing with this card. I don't think that he was using it.
I don't think so either.
Yeah, I don't think so. And it's an interesting choice. I mean, what do you think about using and allocating a point of balance in a deck that is filled with creatures?
It's not the worst idea. You can. It's a little bit like draft, where you can sort of bank a Wrath of God effect, right?
Yeah.
If he's using it that way, and I guess theoretically it gives him some recovery against control decks, but I imagine that he was just looking for another Armageddon effect.
Yeah,
that's
that's right.
Your point about Winter Orb not being here, I think, it's a little strange given that he's got Balance and Armageddon. So I'm not sure how I feel about it, to be honest.
Yeah, it does. And certainly that's an answer that Dave could answer himself down the road, or a question he could answer down the road. But I guess the choice would kind of be between Mox Pearl or something like Land Tax and maybe Winter Orb to run more of that mana denial strategy. I mean, the Moxes in general at 3 points are a huge investment. I've talked about this in prior videos about how I feel like they're kind of in this weird limbo place where I feel like they're just a little too unattractive and inconsistent at 3 points. Spending that much of your budget, I mean approximately 40% of your budget on a card that is almost interchangeable with the basic land once you've moved beyond the 4th or 5th turn of the game, is a little dicey to me, versus a card like Land Tax, which is an engine that can just drive the deck the whole time. But I mean, at a certain point, you can't really argue with Dave's success. We're dealing with the finals matchup, so he's already gone, I think, completely undefeated. I think he was 6-0 in his pod, and he's won his quarterfinal and semifinal match. So at this point, he's 8-0. The Mox Pearl has certainly been serving him well, and hard to argue with that kind of success. So moving on, another card from Mikkel's deck, the Army of Allah, which I think makes perfect sense in this very, very hyper-aggressive White Weenie deck, and can push through 6 or even 8 damage maybe, and combines extremely well with First Strikers as well, particularly banded First Strikers to just punch through something giant. I mean, imagine your opponent attacks you with an Acacian Infantry and a Banalish Hero, and you block, or, well, not a Banalish Hero, maybe with a Pikeman and an Acacian Infantry, and you block with Mahamudi Jinn, and his Army of Allah takes down your Mahamudi Jinn with First Strike, and you feel terrible. So the card can do crazy things. It can punch through big defenders, and it can obviously also deliver a killing blow out of nowhere. Knights of Thorn, which is a card that Mikkel did not use, very, very tough, robust bander, and it has the additional protection from red, which could be very, very problematic for his opponent in this upcoming matchup, as you guys will see. Osai Vulture is a card that Mikkel did not use, but I think works well in the archetype. It's an evasive flyer, and you just kind of can't have enough flyers in this archetype, particularly once they're boosted up, because you can get really gummed up on the ground by walls and things like that, and Moat, of course, which is the kiss of death for White Weenie, and having any type of flying can get past that. And he's got looks like a proxied Chaos Orb here. That's kind of an auto-include in every deck. The Acacian Lieutenant, which I've talked about extensively. Tundra Wolf, same creature. And then Miracle Worker, which is kind of making a little surprise appearance. And that is a very worn Miracle Worker. Look how much play that Miracle Worker has gotten. It's like, like who played this Miracle Worker to the point where it looks like that? Kind of just a random common. I think it's from the Dark that you would normally never see in a deck list. And it has the ability to actually remove enchantments from creatures. The only problem is, of course, is that if you cast a control magic on Miracle Worker, they never have an opportunity to remove the enchantment. But if you control magic a different creature, actually, I think Miracle Worker only removes enchantments from creatures you currently control, so it doesn't actually deal with It doesn't actually deal with control magic if it's stealing something of yours, but maybe, I don't know, there's a small range of things, Gaseous Form, Tackle Maggot, I don't know, what else, Spirit Shackle. I'm thinking of cards that were actually in the deck from the semifinals of the current event.
Actually, there's one that you played on your opponent's creature, which is Spirit Link.
Oh, that's true, actually. I guess that does destroy an enemy Spirit Link. But I think primarily it's in Dave's deck as just a 1-drop. And since there just aren't that many choices for 1-drops in hyper-aggressive White Weenie, that's kind of what you have to go with. We've got Mishra's Factory. There's Diabonin Archer, another card that Mikkel did not use, but can help with the banders to kind of punch through extra damage and forcing your opponent into tough spots where they can't block. The Super All-Star Pendelhaven, which is just incredibly powerful in this archetype. And the ability to move around +1/+2 arbitrarily is like an instant speed equipment and very problematic to deal with, particularly with banding. There's a neat alternate art Sword Splashers there, and then moving down. So he's run with Maze of Ith, which is a hyper-defensive card in a hyper-aggressive deck. What do you think about the choice to use that one?
I'm not a huge fan here. It does have utility, though, in this matchup, just because his opponent has giant growth effects.
Yeah.
So it essentially blanks those. So, I mean, it turns out that, and I haven't seen how this match is going to go, but just looking at the deck list, it may actually be useful here, but it almost feels like accidentally useful and kind of at odds with the LD theme that's in the deck as well.
Yeah, it was a little puzzling to me. One use of Maze of Ith, and that actually probably does come up a fair amount, though, is that if you have a Maze of Ith in play, you can actually kind of alpha strike your opponent often with your own guys, and whatever he happens to block, you can maze to keep your own creature around, so that you're able to attack. Like, let's say your opponent does have a Mahamudi Jinn in play, and you have 3 or 4 ground attackers. Well, you can attack with everything and maze the thing that he blocks to prevent him from actually killing anything and keep your entire board in play. So,
right,
yeah, the added flex. Go ahead.
Well, it makes sense, and I was trying to figure out the interaction between maze and banding. If you can shift all the damage with the bander and then just untap that single creature so it takes no damage, does that work?
Yeah, I don't believe you can assign damage. Maze of Ith says the creature cannot receive damage, I believe. So it's a very interesting idea, the fact that you could maze the creature that's in the band, one of the creatures in the band, and then assign all the damage and have it reduced to 0. But I don't believe that that's how Maze of Ith works. I think that it just simply means that the creature receives no damage, and therefore you can't assign damage to it. But if it works the way that you're describing, that would absolutely explain why Maze is in the deck, because that would be a pretty abusive interaction, honestly, and quite good. And then he's got Eye for an Eye, which is a really cool card to see in the deck. It's a card that I don't think I've ever seen this card played in any decks at all, and it's such a cool example of what makes 7-point Old School Singleton so cool and unique, is the fact that cards like Eye for an Eye show up in Tier 1 competitive decks when normally you would never ever see a card like this ever played. Why do you think? Right. Why do you think he decided to run the card?
Yeah, it's kind of like so in the right conditionally, right? It's like an Army of Allah, actually, in terms of like the ability to just finish off somebody and have reach in white when you shouldn't have it. I mean, who's going to be considering Eye for an Eye when they're thinking about how they're going to make their play? It's pretty good. It also, cards like Army of Allah, Eye for an Eye, and a few others, Crusade, also kind of circle back to making that balance a little bit stronger, because you can afford to dump your hand on effects like that when you're planning to dump your opponent's hand as well.
Yeah, that's a very, very valid point, actually. And I'm sure that Dave has stolen some games where his opponent had complete control of the game and just was happily swinging away with a 4-power flyer or something while sitting at 3 and thinking that they had the game in the bag, and then out of nowhere 4 points of burn to the face from white and the game's over.
Right, exactly.
Moving on, we got Armageddon. Obviously, this is a kind of obligatory include in any type of White Weenie strategy, an incredibly powerful, back-breaking card that I watched Dave destroy his opponent in the, I think, the semi or quarterfinals with it against a 3-color Grixis control deck, where he just blew him out with Armageddon in the 3rd game. Can't really
massively.
Can't really argue with the power of the card. Preacher, probably one of the best creatures in the format, for sure, and definitely one of the best creatures in white. I run it in my own control deck, and it's done ridiculous things. It's so good. And then there's the Dust to Dust, which we discussed. There's Amru Kithkin, which a very, very rare. I mean, you're never going to see Amru Kithkin in any Tier 1 deck normally, and the fact that it's a 1/1 for 2 mana. But Amru Kithkin actually has this interesting ability. I know you can't see the text box on it, but I don't believe it can be blocked by any creature with power greater than 2. Okay. Which means that if you have the ability to crusade it and buff up its health with Pendelhaven or something, the creature becomes effectively unblockable. And unblockable damage is very problematic. It adds up really quick, particularly in a slow format like this that's very attrition-based, where you're kind of often sitting there for turn after turn just top-decking lands, like almost like you're playing Seal Deck or something. And hitting your opponent for 2 or 3 damage a turn unblocked ends the game very, very quickly before your opponent can respond. Repentant Blacksmith, another pro-red guy. Yeah, I'm just looking at a picture of Amarkithkin here. Yeah, so creatures with power greater than 2 may not be assigned to block Amarkithkin. Very interesting card. Repentant Blacksmith, though, with pro-red, banded together with other things, can just give headaches to all of the red decks in the format. And red, I think, is probably... I haven't looked at the data, but based on my understanding of the format, red is the most commonly played color. So pro-red is just phenomenally strong, particularly if you can boost them up. You get an unblockable creature that can soak up any infinite amount of damage on the ground from red sources and cannot be targeted or killed by anything that's red. So very, very good card. Disenchant should be in pretty much every deck list. And then there's Crusade. Canceled across the board, but still legal in this format. And Crusade, I think, was one of the biggest oversights from the deck that I played against in Event 9 in Mikkel's deck. Obviously, it's one of the most powerful cards in this deck that has upwards of, I think, 20 White Weenie creatures. It's probably got like 15 or 16 at least. So strong just in general to buff the board and make your banders just that much more potent. And he's got Samite Healer, which seems kind of weak on its face, but given how ubiquitous Desert is, the fact that Samite Healer can actually keep your creatures alive will often allow you to attack in a situation where a single Desert might shut down your entire offense. And that alone, I think, probably makes the card worth it. And then Dave's decided to use Angelic Voices, which is the weird, never played second copy of Crusade from Legends, which I believe says that all your guys get +1/+1, and your artifact creatures, if your only creatures are artifact creatures and white creatures. And sure, it costs double the amount of mana of Crusade, but the effect is so powerful and important that I think he's rightfully decided to run with it. And then he's got Copper Tablet, which is a very, very powerful threat in the format that shows up in pretty much, well, not all, but most aggressive deck lists. And then moving over, Nate, have you ever played against Witch Hunter before?
I remember being fascinated with the card when I first started, and I couldn't even tell you what it does right now. I have to Google it.
Yeah, well, it has 2 different effects. First of all, it's a pinger that only targets players, which in a format this slow can often be decisive. But its primary ability is for 1 generic and 2 white mana, you can tap it and return a creature an opponent controls to their hand. And having playtested a bunch against Dave's deck with my own control deck, I can say that this creature by itself is what compelled me to add Aelipile to my blue-white deck, because you cannot win with a slow control deck with Witch Hunter in play. It just completely dominates you. It's basically a time elemental for 75% of the mana cost. It's incredibly difficult to deal with. No big creatures can really mount any type of offense with Witch Hunter in play, and it will eventually just kill you all by itself. So really, really cool to see that card in the deck. It's a very seldom seen card from the dark and has a perfect place in White Weenie. And of course, Sarah Angel, obligatory auto-include pretty much in any white deck in the format. Acacian Priest, which was an all-star in Mikkel's deck, super strong. And then Jihad. Moving back to the canceled list, this card, honestly, yes. I've looked at Jihad my entire Magic career and always wondered why this card did not show up in more lists. It is so powerful. I mean, it's 2.5 Crusades, right? +2 power. Right. And sure, your opponent is required to have a certain color of permanent in play to activate it, but what are you going to do? Not play permanents of any color and just, well, they beat you to death with their regular white weenies? And the moment you play anything of any color, suddenly their creatures turn into just crazy beaters that can punch through defensive things like Wall of Swords and the Giant Tortoise and all sorts of other defensive tools. I think Jihad is really woefully underplayed and is, I'm sure, an all-star in Dave's deck and will be probably very decisive in this upcoming match. King Suleiman, really cool to see that in the deck as well. I think that this is another card that you definitely want to play if you're playing White Weenie. There are so many good Jins and Afrits in the format, and King Suleiman just handles them all just fine. He's run with Desert, which I think he can more than afford given that he's mono-white, and then finally the White Knight, which is pretty much auto-include as well. So I'm going to move over to his opponent. His opponent's name is Simon Christie, and Simon is playing a deck that is aggressive, but very, very different from Dave's deck. So let's bring that up.
All right.
All right. Look at this. Red-green. Quite a change from mono-white. And one thing I just want to point out, In fact, you'll see when the games are underway that Simon's nickname in the room on Whereby is MTG Misprint, and you can definitely see why in a second why he has earned that moniker. Look at this deck. What a thing of beauty. If you're into misprints, man, this deck's one of a kind. Just going across how many of the cards in this actual deck are not misprints, or at least not miscut. I'm just scrolling. Okay, so that Caracas looks normal.
That's interesting, because I actually, when I was looking at it, I thought, oh, okay, they let him use proxies, and this is just what he had.
Yeah, no proxies.
You didn't cut him very well.
Yeah, no, proxies are actually legal. I actually meant to say Hammerheim over Caracas, but yeah, he's got a regular Hammerheim, a regular Pendelhaven. The Icy looks real, because imagine getting a miscut or a misprint Alpha Icy Manipulator, which is what that is. Or an Alpha Chaos Orb. Lots of cool stuff in here, but really bizarre cards. You can see this mana bar is just like only about maybe 60% of the card is visible. The Maze of Ith is really, really weirdly off center, so is the Factory. This is such a cool and unique deck, and it's completely understandable why Simon elected to play this particular deck, given the fact that he has all these cool... I mean, I expect that based on his name, he probably has all this cool stuff in his collection. So, anyway... Now that we've acknowledged that, I want to talk about the deck a little bit. This is red-green, and it's a really neat archetype to explore. You can kind of take it in a bunch of different directions. You can kind of play the hyper-aggressive red-green strategy, or you can go with a more controlling red-green strategy. And I would say of the two, it certainly looks like Simon has gone in the hyper-aggressive red-green strategy. So he's got... let's cover the points first. He's got 1 point in Mace of Ith. Nobody can apparently resist that card.
Interesting.
But again, I think it may be for the reason that I pointed out before. Is just it allows you to not lose a game to a big flyer. It allows you to deal with something that maybe has a spirit link on it. And in a pinch, it allows you to just alpha strike with your guys and not lose something in combat. He's devoted 2 points to Black Vice, which is just such a deadly card against any slow deck in the format. And the thing that makes this format so different from regular Old School, particularly with regards to Old School decks, is that the slow decks are really slow. Like there's no way that a slow controlling deck can get one of those Mox, Felwar Stone, Soul Ring draws and just laugh at Black Vice. If you go first and you play a Vice against a deck like my own, like the blue-white control deck, you're going to take like 9 damage at a minimum, maybe even 12, maybe even 15. The card just is insane how much damage it deals for just 1 mana, and is clearly one of the strongest cards in the format, to the point where I almost feel like 2 points is just too cheap for it. But I guess it's just the inconsistency of the card. The fact that if you draw it mid to late game, it's just a lot weaker. That reins in a little bit. He has decided to use Felwar Stone, which is a card that you observed it was being absent from the other deck, and Winter Orb as well, which gives red-green the ability to do mana denial in a way that White Weenie is much more capable of. And as far as other points are concerned, this is 1, 2, 4 points there. Moving down to the bottom here, you can see he's got 1 point on Wheel of Fortune and 1 point on Fireball. And does he actually even have a 7th point?
Yes, it's Regrowth.
Oh, it's Regrowth. Yes, that's right. And in fact, this deck, as of the shift in the points list, would now actually be at 8 points, because Disintegrate, it was showing up in pretty much every single deck list with red automatically. And because it's such a slow and attrition-based format, X spells are just overwhelmingly strong. So Disintegrate was actually given a point recently too. So he would have to prune 1 card from the deck. I expect that he would probably... Well, if you had to remove a card, what do you think you would take out?
Well, I'm curious about one thing before I answer. Is Berserk a pointed card?
It is not.
I don't recall.
No, Berserk is not a pointed card.
So I'd probably... Yeah. So then I'd consider dropping the Regrowth and just putting the Disintegrate in. At least that's a thought that I had. The other option is just dropping the Maze, because I mean, while it does give you cool combat tricks, it's still I'm not sure that they're worth a point.
Yeah, totally. I mean, think about you and I both play control decks and have played control decks pretty much our entire Magic careers. And imagine how good you feel on turn 3 when instead of playing a 3rd mana and casting a Granite Gargoyle, your opponent plays a Maze of Ith and passes the turn back to you. Like how good that feels from the perspective of a control deck.
Right.
Like sure, it means that my Serra Angel 9 turns from now can't attack for 4, but you just played a land that just doesn't do anything to the board state. And,
exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So I do agree with you. I think that in a hyper-aggressive strategy, sure, maybe the Maze comes up every now and then and can affect the game and allow you to attack. But most of the time, it's just a completely defensive card in a deck that's clearly devoted to being balls out damage dealing. and feels a little different to me. But yeah, I think you're probably right. Maybe he would drop that in favor of running the Disintegrate once it costs an extra point. But I'm going to cover the rest of the cards real quick here. Oh, you had a point to make?
Well, it was just that the reason I asked about Berserk is it gets better. You actually want to leave Regrowth in if you're going to run it, because the ability to play it twice on the same turn theoretically just adds the ability to just burst somebody out of the game.
Yeah, totally. They're sitting comfortably at 12 life, and you go, oh, I'm just going to giant growth this, berserk, you're dead.
Right.
From anything, basically. Okay, so covering the rest of the deck, this is honestly I built a red-green deck fairly early on when I started playing the format, and this deck is extremely similar to what I put together. I'm just going to go across the list here. Obviously, he's running these artifacts. I think, all of these. I don't know if I ran Winter Orb. I definitely did not run Maze of Ith. But as far as points were concerned, you know what? I think I may have actually fit a Mox in, because I just felt that having the acceleration in red-green was just so important. Being able to Stone Rain turn 2, for example, consistently just felt so good. But along those lines, he's running all 3 good green accelerators that currently exist in the format: the Birds, the Elves of Deep Shadow, and the Llanowar Elf. He's got Whirling Dervish, an old star back from the Necro Summer in 1996. Scavenger Folk, so cool to see that guy. He's just, I think, a very, very underplayed and excellent card. He's got Scrib Sprites, feeds into the hyper-aggressive strategy. He's got the pair of Grizzly Bears, the original Grizzly Bears, and of course the Barber Apes from Legends, which are awesome. I had those guys in my deck. And then Argothian Pixies, which is super fantastic in Old School, particularly in the formats that are just clogged with Mishra's Factories, because this guy can just laugh at Mishra's Factories and run past them. And some of the other really good artifact creatures in the format, like Triskelion, Su-Chi, and Juggernaut, are also all over the place. So Argothian Pixies has the added bonus of dealing with those guys. He's running Mana Barbs. What do you think about Mana Barbs in the deck?
Oh, I love the Mana Barbs. I think that's... I mean, you're always assuming, of course, that you're ahead on life, but if you're not ahead on life, then your whole game plan is falling apart. And Mana Barbs might actually recover it if the reason you're behind it, your opponent's control, right? So I think just given the fact that he's anticipating having better creatures than his opponent, because getting green means that you generally have better creatures than your opponent.
Yep. So
his primary anticipated enemy is going to be control, and Mana Barbs is just such a house against those decks.
Yeah, it is backbreaking. As far as the control decks that I've built and played in the format, I would put Mana Barbs probably at number 1 most dangerous card that I'm afraid of. Right up there with Armageddon and probably a card like Underworld Dreams. The card is just, you cannot win if they play it. If they have a substantial life lead when they play it, or even a small one, because your entire strategy is based around just spending lots of mana on big things in the mid to late game. If they play Mana Barbs and they've got a 5-6 life point lead on you, you pretty much just die on the spot. That's what it amounts to. It's pretty good for 4 mana.
You don't have a handful of Moxes to work around it like you would normally, so...
Yeah, that's extremely valid. Honestly, the card is so powerful to the point where if I ran the show and Mana Barbs was showing up in a lot of decks, I would actually consider potentially making it a pointed card, because it's just... You're totally right. This format just prices you out of pretty much all the artifact mana, with the exception of Felwar Stone. If you're not playing green for these mana-fixing creatures, you're kind of just relying on lands to do everything you need, and that makes Mana Barbs just impossible to beat if they're ahead of you on life, and you're not way ahead on the board and able to get back into the game. It's just so awful to play against. He's got Elvish Archers, 2 on first strike, just dominates most of the creatures at the beginning of the game, so it's an auto-include. Hurricane, incredibly powerful X spell that has no points associated with it still. Moving down the list, there's Ice Storm and Stone Rain, which are, I think, pretty much ubiquitous auto-includes in any red-green deck. There's enough really strong and powerful problematic lands in the format, primarily Maze of Ith, which shows up in so many decks. A lot of people are running Island of Wak-Wak. There's Pendlehaven, Mishra's Factory, of course, and just general all-purpose land destruction. So I think these 2 cards are excellent choices to include. These miscuts are so bizarre. You spend a point on Regrowth. Giant Growth, I think, is an excellent card in this deck, because it just allows him to push either through damage or 2 for 1 his opponent potentially, or deal with big banding problems and so on. He might be able to punch through with that. Urnam Jin, of course, best green creature, pretty all around probably the best beater in Old School, at least in this era, with the exception of maybe the Serendip Freed. Urnam was everywhere, and the only thing that kept Urnam Jin from being completely tier 1 was the fact that it was green, and the fact that everybody had 4 mana drain in their deck. So a 4-drop was a little bit more dangerous. But Urnam was the definitive creature when Type 2 format appeared, when they kind of splintered off around the Ice Age format. Armageddon was oppressive, and they reprinted it in Chronicles. So it was legal in Type 2, and it was like 25 cents, and in every deck. It was so stupid.
Yeah, and a very good friend to Urnham is Hammerheim, as well as Icy Manipulator. You can just, the creature that you plan to tap anyway, you give that Forest Walk.
Yeah, that's actually a very valid point. The fact that Hammerheim removes all land walking types, you can just completely ignore. Yeah, at least in this deck, in so many of the old Type 2 decks that ran Urnam they didn't even run any forests. They would just run like all Ice Age Painlands and Cities of Brass and stuff. And you could just play Urnam with no drawback at all, and it just seems so out of whack with the rest of the format. There's Dragon Whelp, super incredibly powerful 4-drop that can just hit for 5 in the air every turn. There's Granite Gargoyle, an excellent 3-drop, definitely one of the best 3s. I don't actually see Uthden Troll in here, which is a little surprising to me. I felt like that guy was definitely worth playing. I just think Regeneration is so good, given the fact that opponents can only play with 1 copy of Swords to Plowshares and 1 copy of Disintegrate, and there are no, there's no Incinerator in the format yet, so Regenerators are just really robust and hard to deal with, and I think Uthden Troll is pretty strong guy. So I'm a little surprised not to see it in the deck. There's Scarwood Goblins, just generic red-green beater from, I think it's from the Dark.
Yeah, and I wonder if the text on the Goblins is still there, because it actually says it's a green and red card. So technically, this would be one of the few cards in Magic that, if the text is retained, you could change the color of it, and it would still be green and red.
That's so bizarre. It's true. It counts as a red and green card. It literally says it right on the card, which is so funny that it's got that reminder text. There's Goblin Balloon Brigade. Definitely one of the best 1-drops in the format. Of course, the Curd Ape, which is the best 1-drop in the format. Well, with the exception of maybe Birds of Paradise and the mana-producing guys, but definitely one of the best beaters. This Curd Ape was everywhere back in Old School in the day. If you were playing an aggressive deck, you were probably playing with Curd Ape. And then moving down, of course, he's got Chain Lightning and Lightning Bolt, which are auto-includes. Wow, look at this Lightning Bolt. Is this an alpha that's like completely off-center and bizarre? That is the weirdest-looking alpha Lightning Bolt I have ever seen. It's like a... Yeah. If this thing had a BGS grade for its centering, it would be like a 0. If that were a thing. And we've got Bloodlust, which is an incredibly cool, just crazy amounts of damage out of nowhere. And it really does make you wonder, with both Bloodlust and Giant Growth in the deck, why Simon opted not to play with Berserk. Maybe he couldn't find a good miscut one. He's got Shatter, of course, which is another primary reason to play red. Stone Rain, which I talked about. There's this weird Wheel of Fortune, which has... the bottom of some other... That's a 2/5. Is that Veteran Bodyguard? Hanging out with Wheel of Fortune?
That's a really good guess.
Yeah, I'd have to look at the sheet, but I think that's what that is. I think that's the bottom of Veteran Bodyguard. Nice. And then Pyrotechnics, super powerhouse in the format as a red burn spell that currently doesn't cost anything. I noticed there's no Earthquake as well, although him not running Earthquake makes sense with this many ground creatures. And of course, Fireball, Disintegrate, and the Mighty Detonate. So... before we move to the games, which we'll cover in an upcoming video, I wanted to ask Nate's opinion about who do you think is favored in this matchup? Is it
that's an
the white deck,
one.
Dave's white deck, or is it the red-green beatdown deck? If you had to place your bets, and keep in mind, I believe this is a best-of-5 matchup. They'll be playing best-of-5, so accounting for draw variance and RNG, what do you think, Nate? What are you going to place your bets on?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Honestly, I want to say it's the red green deck, but I actually, the more I look at it, the white deck's got a lot of having the natural pro red cards. Considering they're both playing somewhat similar strategies, so that the power of cards like Anka Mishra aren't as good. The Vice, which is normally a big threat, loses some teeth against White Weenie.
Very true.
And the fact that White can just completely crush him with a powerful card like Armageddon, Balance, or just an unchecked pre-trill that's less likely considering what he's facing. Yeah. But all things told, plus a main deck dust to dust against quite a few targets.
Yeah. So
I'm gonna go with the white deck, but that's gonna be my guess.
Yeah, I think I really do think it's super close. I would say that if the red deck had Earthquake, obviously he could not have known that he needed it, and a card like Mana Barbs, of course. I think one way to assess this is how many cards do these guys have, respectively, that are just really bad and dead against each other. And I would say that, provided that we say that Black Vice and Anka Mishra are both effectively dead cards against White Weenie. I don't think Icy Manipulator is particularly good, obviously just tapping down one thing, but you can keep a Bander at bay, which can can often help you from getting punched in the face. Mana Barbs, of course, will only work when he's ahead. I think Hurricane is still very good. Detonate, not particularly great against Dave's deck. He doesn't really have many good targets for that. Same for Shatter. And it's just going to really come down to, I think, the Crusades, to be honest. If there's no Tranquility at all in Simon's deck. It's just a really, really hard card to kind of fit into your deck because the effect is so narrow and the card is so expensive. That leaves him with just Chaos Orb as a way to deal with the 3 different Crusades that are in Dave's deck. And I think the Crusades ultimately will probably be the most problematic thing. I think that Dave's success is going to come down to whether or not he draws the Crusades, because if he doesn't draw the Crusades, I think he will be outclassed by the red-green creatures and by all that red removal. And if once he's sort of lost control of the game, with the exception of balance, he doesn't really have any way back into it. But in the interest of keeping things interesting, I'm going to place my bet on the red-green deck, and I'm going to say that this is going to go to Game 5, and that Simon will prevail 3-2. So
interesting.
We'll see how it goes, guys. Thanks so much for watching the intro, and we will see you in just a couple minutes or I guess in the next video, for Game 1 of this Event 10 final matchup. See you then.